Hello, classmates. Today we begin to study globalization and the environment, focusing on the three contents: globalization, growth, and pollution. The problem of pollution heaven and the carbon turf disputes. Concerns about human impacts on the environment are growing in much of the world. Inevitably, then, environment issues are playing a growing role in disputes about international trade as well. Some anti-globalization activists claimed that growing international trade automatically harms the environment. Some also claim that international trade agreements, particularly WTO, have the effect of blocking environment action. However, most international economists view the first claim as simplistic and they disagree with the second. That means they deny there is a simple relationship between globalization and the environment damage. And they do not believe that trade agreements prevent countries from having united environment policies. Nonetheless, the intersection of trade and the environment does raise a number of important issues. First, we will discuss the relationship among globalization, growth, and pollution. Both production and consumption often lead as a byproduct to environmental damage. Factories emit pollution into the air and sometimes dump effluent into rivers. Farmers use fertilizers and pesticides that end up in the water. Consumers drive pollution-emitting cars. As a result, economic growth, which increases both production and consumption, leads to greater environmental damage. However, as countries grow richer, they change the mix of their production and consumption to some extent in ways that tend to reduce the environmental impact. For instance, as the U.S. economy becomes increasingly devoted to the production of services rather than goods, it tends to use less energy and raw material per dollar of GDP. At the same time, growing wealth tends to lead to growing political demand for environmental quality. As a result, rich countries generally impose strict regulations to ensure clean air and water than poorer countries. In the early 1990s, Princeton economists Jim Grossman and Alan Gluger studied the relationship between national income levels and pollutants such as sulfur dioxide, found that these offsetting effects of economic growth lead to a distinctive inverted U relationship between per capita income and the environmental damage known as the environmental Kuznets curve. This concept could be illustrated in Figure 1. The idea is that as a country income per capita rises due to economic growth, the initial effect is growing damage to the environment. For instance, India, whose economy has surged recently, is in effect moving from point A to point B. As the country produces more goods in its factories, it emits more sulfur dioxide into the air and dumps more effluent into its rivers. But when a country gets sufficiently rich, it can afford to take action to protect the environment. As the United States has grown richer in recent decades, it has also moved to limit pollution. For example, a government licensing scheme limits emissions of sulfur dioxide from power plants and so on. On its environmental Kuznets curve, it moved from C to point D, growing richer and doing less damage to the environment. What does this have to do with international trade? Trade liberalization is often advocated on the grounds that it will promote economic growth. To the extent that it succeeds in accomplishing this end, it will raise per capita income. Will this improve or worsen environmental quality? It depends on which side of the environmental Kuznets curve's economy is on. In the original paper, which was in part a response to criticals of the North American Free Trade Agreement, who argued that the agreement would be environmentally harmful. Grossman and Globalization suggested that Mexico might be on the right side of the curves, that is, to the extent that NAFTA raises Mexican income. It might actually lead to the reduction in environmental damage. However, the environmental Kuznets curve does not by any means necessarily imply that globalization is good for the environment. This argument would run as follows. The biggest single beneficiary of globalization has arguably been China, whose export-led economy has experienced incredible growth since 1980. Meanwhile, the single biggest environmental issue is surely climate change. There is broad scientific consensus that emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are leading to a rise in the Earth's average temperature. China's boom has been associated with a huge increase in its emission of carbon dioxide. Figure 2 shows carbon dioxide emissions of the United States, Europe, and China from 1980 to 2010. In 1980, China was a minor factor in global warming. By 2010, it was by a substantial margin. the world-leading emitter of greenhouse gases. It is important to realize, though, that the problem here is not globalization per se. It's China's economic success, which has to some extent come as a result of globalization. And despite the environmental concerns, it's difficult to argue that China's growth, which has raised hundreds of millions of people out of dire poverty, is a bad thing. Second, we will discuss the problem of pollution havens thanks to international trade and economic activity that is subjected to strong environmental controls in some countries can take place in other countries with less strict regulation, which becomes the pollution heaven. There are really two questions about the pollution heavens. The first is whether they are really an important factor. The second is whether they deserve to be a subject of international negotiation. On the first question, most empirical research suggests that the pollution heaven effect on international trade is relatively small. That is, there is much evidence that dirty industries move to countries with lax environmental regulation. For example, some shipping breaking firms in advanced countries have moved to India's shipping breaking center of Alang, which has become a pollution heaven. But lots of economists consider that India's low wages seem to have been more of lower than its loose environmental restrictions. On the second question, it turns out to depend on the nature of the environmental problem. Pollution is the classical example of a negative externality, a cost that individuals impose on others but don't pay for. That is why pollution is a valid reason for government intervention. However, different forms of pollution have very different geographical reach, and only those that extend across national boundaries obviously justify international concern. Thus, to the extent that India's ship breaking pollutes the local environment alone, this is a problem for India. It is less clear that it is a problem for other countries. Similarly, air pollution in Mexico City is a problem for Mexico. It is not clear why it is valid for U.S. interest. On the other hand, emission of carbon dioxide affects the future climate for all countries. They are an international externality and they deserve to be a subject of international negotiation. At this point, it is hard to come up with major examples of industries in which the pollution heaven phenomenon, to the extent that it occurs, leads to international negative externality. That situation may change dramatically. However, if some, but not all major economies adopt strong policies to limit climate change. Last, let's look at the carbon tariff dispute. In 2009, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill that would have created a cap and trade system for greenhouse gases. That is, a system under which a limited number of emissions licenses are issued, and the firms are required to buy enough licenses to cover their actual emissions, in effect putting a price on carbon dioxide and other gases. The Senate failed to pass any comparable bill, so climate change legislation is on hold for the time being. Nonetheless, there was a key trade provision in the House bill that may represent the shape of things to come. It imposed carbon tariffs on imports from countries that fail to enact similar policies. The idea behind carbon tariffs is to charge importers of goods from countries without climate change policies an amount proportional to the carbon dioxide emitted in the production of those goods. The charge per ton of emissions would be equal to the price of carbon dioxide emission license in the domestic market. This would give overseas producers an incentive to limit their carbon emission and would remove the incentive to shift production to countries with lax regulation. In addition, it would possibly give countries with lax regulations an incentive to adopt climate change policy of their own. Critics of carbon tariffs argue that they would be protectionist and also violate international trade rules, which prohibit discrimination between domestic and foreign products. Supporters argue that they would simply place producers of imported goods and domestic producers on the level playing field when selling to domestic consumers, with both required to pay for the greenhouse gas emission, and because carbon tariffs create a level playing field, they argue such tariff should also be legal under existing trade rules. At this point, the issue of carbon tariffs is hypothetical, since no major economy has yet placed a significant price on greenhouse gas emissions. Correspondingly, the WTO has not issued any rules on the legality of such tariffs, and probably will not until or unless a real case emerges. That's all for this lecture. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.